Hello, my name is Dr. Drew Gray and I'm a lecturer in crime at the University of Northampton. Today I'd like to talk to you about two women, one in particular, and their impact on legislation in the late 19th century to do with drunkenness. This is the story, really, of one working class woman and the impact she had on society in the late 1800s. She was born into poverty and, like so many of her class in Victorian London, she remained impoverished for most or all of her life. Her name was probably Amy Anderson, but thousands of people up and down the country would know her much better by the colourful name of Totty Fay. This is because Amy, or Totty as I shall call her from now on, had that rare thing, star quality. With a different set of circumstances, Totty might have become a musical star, like Mary Lloyd. In many ways, Totty's life and career resembled a melodrama or a series of musical performances. Indeed, at one point, someone did pen a skit based on Totty's frequent visits to the capital's police court. In this talk, I will set out Totty's rise to fame, describe how she captivated the audiences she performed for, before going on to track her decline into alcoholism and ultimately permanent exclusion from society. Along the way, I will also tell the related story of Jane Cakebread, another celebrity police court performer who captured the attention of the Victorian press. Her story is less colourful than Totty's, but no less important in explaining how these two ordinary working class women helped change the way in which alcoholism was viewed in the 1890s. Alcoholism and its control are central to this narrative. Both Totty Fay and Jane Cakebread enjoyed a drink, as did many in Victorian London. Working class drinking, however, was seen, like gambling, as a deeply corrupting and sinful malaise by well-meaning moralists like the men and women of the temperance movement and the Salvation Army. Drink led to idleness and poverty. It accelerated domestic violence. It undermined Christian values and it destroyed lives. By the 1890s, police court missionaries were a familiar presence at police courts, advising magistrates and helping those defendants who were prepared to recognise that they had a problem with drink. All working class drinking was considered a societal problem, but female drunkenness was something of a particular concern. And the archetypal female drunk was encapsulated in the persons of Totty Fay and Jane Cakebread, two of the wickedest women in London. Before I tell their story in full, however, we need a little background and context. Let us turn to the stage on which they both performed, the late Victorian police court. Most of the history of crime and punishment written in the last 50 years or more has concentrated on serious crime and serious punishments. Nearly all true crime is obsessed with homicide or with so-called organised crime, gangs and the mafia. Academic history has tended to focus on property crime prosecuted before a judge and jury, on the tens of thousands of working class men and women who were hanged, transported or imprisoned for stealing property worth as little sometimes as a shilling. The focus has been on courts like the Old Bailey, London Central Criminal Court, where our records are excellent. But the reality was that the vast majority of people in Victorian London never saw the inside of the Bailey. Most of those that had brushes with the law were prosecuted summarily before a magistrate in the police court. Here, a single magistrate, a man with at least 7 years' experience of working as a barrister, had tremendous discretionary power. He could remand, fine and imprison offenders. He could send them to be tried before a jury where, if found guilty, they could suffer the full gamut of punishments from penal servitude to death by hanging. A magistrate was advised on the law by his clerk, if he needed any advice. He was supported by other court officers like the jailer, who knew which defendants had been through his hands before, and who had failed to learn the lessons previous magistrates had handed down. This was to be crucial in the cases of Totty Fay and Jane Cakebread, as we shall see. By the end of the 19th century, London had over a dozen police courts. The City of London, as a separate governing authority, had two at Guildhall and Mansion House, while Bow Street in Covent Garden was accepted as the most superior court, and its magistrate deemed chief amongst his peers. Thames Police Court and Worship Street covered the notoriously rough and criminal East End, while Woolwich and Lambeth dealt with the southern half of the city. In the centre, Marylebone and Westminster and Clerkenwell all supported Bow Street. Other police courts were situated in Greenwich, West Ham, Lavender Hill, Stoke Newington, Kensington, and Great Marlborough Street. While anyone could bring a case to the police magistrate courts, they generally functioned mostly to deal with the detritus swept off the streets by the men of the Metropolitan Police. Created in 1829, Robert Peel's Blue Bottles patrolled the capital streets day and night and were tasked with keeping law and order and protecting the public from harm. Almost inevitably, a large proportion of their time was spent in telling drunken Londoners to go home and go to bed. When someone refused to go home, or worse, gave the officer a mouthful of abuse, a night in the cells would often be their reward. While for some that might be the end of things, for very many others this was followed by an appearance in court the next day. Although the police intelligence columns of the daily and weekly newspapers offered their readership a varied and often sensationalised selection of cases from the Metropolitan Police Courts, the reality was often much more mundane. The records of the Thames Police Court reveals that it was the offences that involved overindulgence in alcohol that resulted in the largest single proportion of prosecutions before magistrates. To put a figure on it, something like 40% of all offences recorded at police courts were drink-related. Drunken disorderly, drunken fighting, assaulting a policeman whilst drunk, drunken disorderly, and using foul or obscene language were just a few of the offences concerned. Policemen were advised, if not required, to take individuals into custody for their own safety. Police had to make a judgment as to whether the person was insensible, not through drink, or just plain drunk. The law that covered public drunkenness was the 1872 Licensing Act, Section 12 of which stated that every person found drunk on any highway or any other public place, whether a building or not, or on any licensed premises, shall be liable to a penalty, with additional penalties on a sliding scale for any subsequent conviction. By default, anyone unable or unwilling to pay the fine would face imprisonment for up to 2 weeks, although magistrates increasingly seem to have agreed it did little good. As will become clear when looking at the cases of our two notorious serial drunkards, Totty Fay and Jane Cakebread, magistrates were presented with a particular challenge by defendants that exhibited all the signs that a modern doctor would understand as alcoholism. Until the last part of the 19th century, however, the police and the summary process continued to treat public drunkenness as a social problem that should be dealt with as a personal failing in the individual concerned, not as something best understood by environmental factors or as an example of poor mental health. This would change in the 1890s, and our heroines had something of a part to play in this. Totty Fay was born as Amy Anderson in Seven Dials in about 1865. Her father was reported to have been a costermonger, meaning he sold goods from a barrow in the street and would have had regular run-ins with the police. Seven Dials was notorious in the 1800s as a place of poverty, immorality, and crime. It had rookeries where the police simply didn't go. It was very far from the trendy quarter of London near Covent Garden that it is today. Totty's father, it was alleged, had also been a member of a street gang dubbed the 40 Thieves, one of many local gangs that predated the hooligan panic of the 1890s. Not surprisingly then, given the cards dealt her, Totty's most pressing concern was to leave her upbringing a long way behind her. As a result, Totty attempted to create a new identity for herself, one that took her out of the slums and placed her instead in respectable society. One of the saddest things about Totty's story is the way in which the papers ridiculed her attempt to rise above her station, to try to be someone she was not. Victorian society was not one that embraced social mobility. Rather, it preferred people, especially women, to know their place. Between 1879 and February 1884, Totty was convicted of a number of offences at police courts. These included theft, illegal pawning, and, in November 1883, soliciting prostitution. This suggests that Totty's criminal career began sometime around the age of 14, and that by 18 she was prostituting herself. This should come to no surprise to anyone that has studied the lives of poor women in 19th century London. We have ample evidence to suggest that prostitution was rife in the Victorian capital, even if we might choose to take Henry Mayhew's calculations of it with a pinch of salt. While it's now disputed that all of Jack the Ripper's victims were prostitutes, it remains overwhelmingly likely that they had resorted to selling sex on the nights that they were killed. Totty Fay was a West End prostitute, it seems. Unlike her East End sisters, she aimed to attract a wealthier client by plying her trade in the clubs, theatres and hotels of the capital's entertainment district. If we can discern her modus operandi in the 1880s, it was something like this. Totty, fashionably dressed, would persuade men to buy her a drink or two as they left the venue late at night or in the early hours of the morning. Then, fortified with spirits, they would head off to a nearby hotel where a quick bribe to the porter would secure them a room. This was safe by comparison to the women walking the streets of Whitechapel and much more comfortable. However, it was risky, especially if you asked the wrong man or was seen doing so by a policeman. Moreover, for Totty, it seems, the alcohol consumed, perhaps initially as part of the strategy and partly to numb the experience, began to take over. Either way, when she was in liquor, she became rowdy, and that attracted people and ultimately attracted the police. So it was that from the late 1880s, Totty started to become a regular in London's police courts and soon captured the imagination of the newspapers. The first time that Totty Fay appears in print was in the spring of 1887, when she'd already clearly earned a reputation with the police courts of the metropolis. In its occasional notes section, the Pall Mall Gazette referred to her as the wickedest woman in London. The report noted that along with the name Totty Fay, she'd amassed a variety of pseudonyms that included Lillian Rothschild, Violet St. John, Mabel Gray, Maud Legrand, and Lily Levant. The paper thought she was about 30 years of age. She was actually only 22, and was dressed well, if slightly eccentrically. On this occasion, the sitting justice, Mr. Mansfield at Marlborough Street, commented that she had more than once perjured herself by making false accusations against men, and had for a long time persisted in a life of vice and crime. He regretted he was only allowed to send her away for a month, or fine her 40 shillings. Since she didn't have the money, off to jail she went. If Mansfield's intention was to teach Totty a lesson she would not forget, then he was clearly unfamiliar with her history. Offenders like her knew the best strategy was not to be caught too many times in the same place and set before the same magistrate. If you became known to the police and the magistracy, your chance of avoiding a heavy fine and/or prison was slim indeed. Which explains her consistent use of false names and a well-rehearsed justification of her appearance in court. For Totty, it was pretty much always the case that she'd been led to drink by someone else, such as a man, or reduced to it by some cataclysmic event, for example, the death of a close relative or friend. Both her actions in court, her lambasting of the police as mean, overbearing, or violent, and her appearance in contrived persona fascinated the court reporters. Totty's frequent visits to courts were reported in great detail, with lots of space given to her clothes, jewellery, her hats and accessories, and to recording her words and her demeanour. On the 11th of April, Totty appeared in a police court after being found drunk and surrounded by a crowd in the early hours of the morning. She claimed she was due at the funeral of her poor sister, a declaration that was met with laughter in the court. Last time, she said it was her dear mumma, interrupted the assistant jailer, adding that she'd only just been let out of Millbank prison the day before. Convicted once more of being drunk and disorderly, Totty was led away to begin another stretch inside, this time for 21 days. When she appeared in court the following June, she almost fooled the bench with her disguise. Calling herself Lily de Greys, it took a jailer and a court reporter to identify her to Mr. Newton as a regular at Marlborough Street. The charge was drunk and disorderly, but the circumstances a little different. This time she had taken lodgings in Langham Street, only to cause chaos in a series of examples of drunken bad behaviour, which culminated in her being found running naked, which probably meant in her underclothes, throughout the house. Worried for the reputation of her house and the safety of herself and children, she was thrown out on the street by the landlady, where a policeman arrested her. She was sentenced to another month inside. This then was the pattern of Totty Fay's offending in the late 1880s. Sporadic, if frequent, arrests for drunken disorderly behaviour, which produced colourful appearances in court that amused the newspaper reading public over their breakfast or supper. At some point, however, the ground began to shift underneath her, and Totty's relatively trivial brush with the law became more serious. So far, then, Totty's career had been one that amused the reading public, even while it annoyed the overworked police and magistracy. By the end of the 1880s, she'd appeared dozens of times, mostly for being drunk and disorderly. Alongside her, but as far as I can tell, never ever meeting or knowing each other, is our other star of the police courts, Jane Cakebread. Jane was older than Totty, well into her 50s or early 60s by the late 1880s. She'd also appeared many more times, although for Jane I can find no hint that she was involved in prostitution. She was a habitual drunk, but she never seemed to go beyond that. She may have been a prostitute in her younger days, but I've no hint that she was. Cakebread seems to have come from just north of London, from Enfield or Hertfordshire. Nearly all her court appearances were at North London Police Court, and her offences were committed in and around Stoke Newington and Dalston. In late July of 1888, Jane was charged with being drunk and disorderly at Dalston Police Court. According to the jailer, she'd been up before the bench there 3 times since April, although she disputed this. Now, only twice, she insisted. This time, a policeman had arrested her for causing a disturbance at Finsbury Park by drawing a crowd about her as she lay on the ground drunk and swearing loudly at those that gawked at her. She claimed to be a lady, and she had a fortune left me. Like Totty Fay, who always claimed she was someone she was not, or had just returned from Paris, or was missing her poor dead mamma, it seems that Jane Cakebread was not only an alcoholic, but delusional as well. From July 1888, Cakebread had only recently been released from prison, and the sitting magistrate remanded her while inquiries were made into her mental health. In the end, Cakebread, who was described as elderly, was allowed to go home to Hertfordshire without further punishment. The reporter noted that she'd built up quite a staggering 209 appearances for drunkenness at London police courts in her life. 209 became 210 just over a month later. This time, Cakebread was picked up in Victoria Park in the East End for being drunk and reminding passers-by that she was a lady. In court, she denied using any bad language and claimed to have been singing a hymn. She was remanded again, an outcome that caused her to remark, "What for? I was drunk, I own, but you don't know your place and chance it." The court seemed to be aware that fining or locking her up did no good whatsoever, and so treated her more leniently than Totty Fay, perhaps on account of her advanced years. In April, Jane Cakebread reappeared at Dalston again for her 219th conviction. She denied striking a police officer in the chest as he escorted her back to the station from a public house in Stoke Newington. When Mr. Smith, the magistrate, inquired as to Cakebread's occupation, she interrupted the jailer and claimed that she had been an upper parlour maid in a gentleman's family at Stamford Hill. This may have been the case once, but it certainly wasn't now. Perhaps Cakebread was a servant who lost her position and ended up on the streets, with drink as her only solace. The magistrate at Dalston sent her to prison for a month with hard labour. "Thank you kindly, sir. I hope it will be the last," said Jane Cakebread as she was led away. It was not her last conviction. In August, she was fined 10 shillings after biting a constable in Green Lanes. She thanked Mr. Saunders for his trouble and left. The report stated she was 62 years of age. In January 1889, Totty was back at Marlborough Street, but this time Mr. Hannay was in the chair. He'd not encountered her before, which gave her the opportunity to try and convince him she was a victim of Melissa's prosecution and police brutality. By this time, the paper noted she'd acquired several new aliases, taking her tally past 20 and adding Blanche Herbert, Florence Lorard, and Amy St. Clair to those listed earlier. This time she was charged with being drunk and riotous in Piccadilly on New Year's Eve. She'd been arrested in the Bath Hotel in Piccadilly after the proprietor had thrown her out for her disreputable behaviour. He testified that Totty had been running undressed all over the hotel. When approached, she locked herself in a room and refused to come out. The door was forced and she was dragged out and led away by the police. It seems she'd been using the room there to meet clients. On this occasion, a West End gentleman who didn't appear in court. Mr. Hannay fined her 40 shillings, which, as she never had any money, meant another month inside. In June, Totty Fay was back in court again, calling herself Lily de Terry and giving an address in Grosvenor Square. She dressed more quietly than usual, the better perhaps to attract sympathy, or evidence that she was unable to afford anything more glamorous. P.C. Evans had arrested her on the 8th of June, 1889, after he found her with a crowd around her in Porchester Road, protesting that someone had stolen her purse. She was very drunk, he said, and as she questioned her, she tried to get away, saying, "Oh, I've got it now, thank you," meaning her purse. When the officer attempted to prevent her leaving, she gave him a mouthful of verbal abuse and threw herself onto the floor. At first she wouldn't budge, and a fellow officer ran to fetch an ambulance, a Bischofenheim handcart, not a horse-drawn vehicle. Tottie decided her self-esteem and public image was best served by getting up and walking to the station, not being dragged there on a cart, and so the constables removed her. The next day she was brought up before Mr. de Rudson, who questioned her. Tottie gave a very similar tale of being a lady, not being guilty, apologising and promising not to her in future. The magistrate took pity and gave her a small fine and a day in jail by default. She thanked him with a "Heaven bless you" and was removed. By now she was so infamous that the Illustrated Police News even included an artist's impression of her arrest. She was pictured again in August as the well-known Tottie Fay after she appeared in court using the name Mabel Granville. This time her drunkenness was compounded with theft or fraud. P.C. Orchard testified that he'd been called to a pastry cook shop on Belgrave Street after Granville Fay had refused to pay for the 2 pots of tea, 4 eggs and a considerable quantity of bread she consumed. She was drunk and her language was shocking. She had complained the eggs were undercooked. They were like water, she said, and a row had broken out when the unladylike person in the shop called a policeman and accused her of being drunk. Whether she paid her fine this time or went to prison for a fortnight is unclear, but she was not long out of the news. Within a few weeks she was back in court, this time at Bow Street. There a gentleman testified that Tottie had tried to push into his house and was otherwise molesting him. This was all part of her tactics. When she had no money to pay for a cab, she would solicit it from a nearby man, and if he refused, push him and then accuse him of assaulting her. Her hope was that he would settle up in order to avoid further annoyance. One reporter described her as conducting her defence in her usual simpering, semi-hysterical manner. This again consisted of denying the charge, offering a fanciful story of being left to pay for another man's champagne, coming from a respectable family, and adding that she'd recently taken the temperance pledge. The jailer reminded the justice that she was a regular, well known to all the police courts in the capital, and that she'd be given opportunities to amend her ways on many occasions. Apparently a Jewish lady from Kensington took a great interest in her and took her into her house. She stayed about a fortnight, and during that time her behaviour was very bad. He also outlined more details of her MO for the benefit of the court. She dressed well, hailed a cab, claiming to have just arrived in town, which she then offered to take to her, and then offered to take her to a hotel. Her luggage was a single box, which, while she claimed it contained her clothes, etc., was actually usually empty. Fay was either fraudulently intent on avoiding paying for services like transport, accommodation and food, or hopeful of making the acquaintance of a man that would pay for them in return for her company, or perhaps something more intimate. Or perhaps she simply had become lost in her own fantasies and, fueled by drink, could no longer separate truth from fiction. The court ordered her to find 2 sureties of £20 each for her good behaviour for 6 months, a tall order for Tottie Fay. Tottie Fay's 31st appearance in May 1890 was dramatic to say the least. She was dressed in a light blue silk ball dress which sported a profusion of lace flounces. Over this she had a purple-brown costume, relieved by a large white silk bow at the back, an enormous dress improver, and she carried, as she entered the dock, a bright scarlet lace-trimmed opera mantle. On her head was a jaunty little cricket cap, which only partly hid her greasy black hair. And on her nose were a pair of opera glasses. She must have made a remarkable sight. Yet, for all her gaudy glamour, she could no more hide her desperate circumstances than she can hide her unwashed hair and dirty face. The policeman that arrested her had already cleared her and a crowd around her away once that night, but she simply moved somewhere else and caused a second disturbance. She claimed to have been robbed, which was probably a distraction to win sympathy. Her drug drunks were often the victims of street robbery. Having listened to Tottie's excuses and promises of reform, Mr. Newton decided to remand her for a week so some inquiries could be made. He told her he wanted to find out all about you and a plainclothes officer was assigned to her case. On May 17th, Totty was brought up from the cells to hear what the inquirers about her had discovered. She cut a sad figure in the dock, clutching a bunch of artificial flowers, and attempted to conceal some bread and cheese beneath them. The jailer quickly removed them, and Totty was left to listen to the testimony of a matron from Millbank Prison and the chief jailer from Bow Street, both of whom could speak to her former career. The Bow Street jailer cited the incident related earlier when Totty was asked to find sureties against her good behaviour or go to prison for 6 months. This was serious because this current charge of drunken disorderly behaviour could be deemed a breach of that agreement. Constable Bush reported that she'd been 20 times before the court at Bow Street, and people had tried to help her. Mrs. Sullivan, the matron from Millbank, said she'd known Totty since 1879 when, as Lily Cohen, she'd been convicted of a felony. She recalled her being in prison for 6 months in 1886 for stealing a case of surgical instruments. Totty spoke in her own defence. Those felonies you charged me with were a long time ago, you know. Before going on to give her usual account of the death of her mother or mistress in mitigation. There was laughter in court at this, almost as if she was a musical turn, regaling them with a much-loved and very familiar performance. It was clear that her criminal career was catching up with her, and Mr. Newton was determined that it must be stopped. Despite her pleas that a criminal trial and the long prison sentence that might result in would be injurious to her health, he committed her. As the jailer tried to lead her away, she reprimanded him. Don't pull me like that. How dare you, you naughty man? What would my poor mamma say? On the 27th of May, 1890, Totty was tried at Clerkenwell Green in the London County Sessions on a charge of stealing with intent to defraud. She had claimed to be an actress at the Alhambra Theatre, but the manager appeared to deny this was the case. Her fantasies continued. She wove an elaborate story of taking a train from Paris, having breakfast with her daughter, forgetting her luggage at Victoria before denying both charges of stealing clothes and food. Despite a tearful appeal to the court, the jury convicted her, and she was sent to prison for 6 months with hard labour. In December 1890, Totty Fay was again charged, like Marlborough Street, with being drunk and riotous. P.C. Carter had heard the screams of a woman as he patrolled his beat near Portland Place at 3 a.m. He found Totty arguing with a cab driver over the fare and complaining that she was a respectable young lady, whilst demanding to be admitted to her mamma's house. She'd been trying to ring the bells on several doors, and the policeman had roughly pulled her away. Since she could hardly stand up, he led her back to the station, where she spent a night in custody. In court, the officer explained that on the previous evening, officers had removed Totty from the residence of the Chinese ambassador for a similar disturbance. Fay said she'd been trying to secure work as a maid, but was being thwarted by policemen who kept locking her up. Mr. Hannah sent her to prison for another month. This would take Totty Fay into the new year 1891, and right on cue, she was back to her old ways almost as soon as she'd been released. Appearing as Violet LaBelle, Totty was charged at Bow Street with disorderly conduct and obscene language. Dressed eccentrically in an opera cloak fastened with a spray of imitation diamonds and with her hands festooned with brass rings, Fay tried to interrupt the police testimony. She loudly complained about those wicked policemen who clubbed together to ruin me. When the jailer pointed out her extensive record before the court, she turned on him. Oh, look at the wicked lies you've told. I'll have you for this, she said. The magistrate ordered her to find sureties for her good behaviour for 3 months. Oh my God, she responded, 3 months, before being let back to the cells. The Daily News headed its report of the incident as hopeless depravity and repeated the court's insistence that every effort had been made on her behalf by charitable ladies, all to no avail. What they did not or could not understand was that Amy, Totty Fay Anderson, was suffering from a form of mental and physical illness, an addiction to alcohol and a personality disorder, both of which needed treating, not punishing by yet another term of imprisonment. Nevertheless, it seems that unable to find the £10 sureties, there was little choice but to return Totty Fay to a prison cell. On the 25th of April 1891, the Penny Illustrated paper offered a pen portrait of Totty Fay for its readers. This was almost a full-page splash on one of London's many notabilities, as the paper described him. The accompanying sketch, seen here, was taken as Totty was being prosecuted for an alleged fraud on Fisher's Hotel. She was diminutive, just 5 foot tall and squat, dressed as ever in a dazzling combination of fake fur, gloves, cheap jewellery, and with a pearl coronet on her head. Mr. Magnus Hiarley complained that Totty had arrived at his property, Fisher's Hotel in Clifford Street, St. James, in the early hours of the morning, and had claimed that she had engaged room number 5 and that her father and mother had stayed there last week. The porter showed her up, and in the morning she was served breakfast. At 8 o'clock in the evening she was asked by the proprietor to leave, and was met with a blank refusal. He threatened her with the police, but she continued to refuse to budge. He had her taken away. It would seem she'd not paid anything, and the story about her parents was a lie or a fantasy, and with Totty the two seemed interchangeable. Again, Totty Fay tried to deny it all, claiming the prosecutor had promised not to proceed with the charge. She pointed at the porter from the dock and said he must have known that no respectable lady would have been out at that time of night, particularly without an escort. The magistrate remanded her for a week so the other staff could be brought to give evidence. A week later, the hearing reconvened, and a housemaid explained how she'd brought the guest in room 5 a chop with tea and bread and butter in the middle of the afternoon. That was probably the breakfast mentioned earlier. She then brought her 3 bottles of ale, which explained her boisterous and belligerent mood later on. Totty provoked laughter from the court at this by declaring that just 1 bottle would go to her head, since she was a young maiden lady, you know. Eventually, she was committed to face trial by jury at the Middlesex Sessions of the Police. This took place in May 1891 at Clerkenwell, before Sir Peter Henry Edling, QC. Totty gave her name as Lily St. John, and the court recorded her age at 42. She offered a plea of not guilty more share when asked by the clerk, promised to mend her ways if acquitted. The court found her guilty of obtaining goods by false pretences and sentenced her to 12 months imprisonment with hard labour. The papers referred to it as a temporary retirement. In September, while the real Totty Fay languished in prison, a stage comedy focused on a police court included her as a notorious character, creating hearty laughter and applause. I'm not sure Totty would have liked that. She might have enjoyed the attention, but I think she really did see herself as a victim of a hard life and the society didn't support her. She had a great sense of self-respect despite her drinking, evidenced by a desire to always look as glamorous as she could. As she went from being a high-class prostitute to a drunk reduced to stealing small amounts of food and drink, she also fell foul, however, of the criminal justice system. In the week ending 15th of May 1892, Totty Fay, this time calling herself Mabel Carlton, was prosecuted for disorderly behaviour with obscene language. She had only just been released from Wormwood Scrubs prison and had immediately commenced plying her occupation, the paper reported. She'd been arrested after being seen with a man in Portland Place. She claimed the man had invited her to share a glass of champagne and then offered to pay for a cab, both of which she, as a modest young lady, had refused. At that moment, a horrid policeman had come along and the man had quickly moved away. She'd been arrested for using bad language and was probably correct in suggesting that was all the officer could arrest her for. To have evidence of her soliciting, he'd have needed the man to testify, which most would have been reluctant to do, or to have overheard the conversation. Totty thought it was harassment. I really cannot walk in the streets now, she said. If I'd been in trouble before, am I to be locked up? Mr. Newton warned her not to come before him again and let her go. Totty promised to join a Young Women's Christian Society and thanked him as she left. The same paper reported that Jane Catebread had been up before Mr. Courser again, only a week after being let out of jail. She promised to return to her sister in Ware if he let her off again. The magistrate remanded her so inquiries could be made as to where her sister lived, or even if she actually existed, and if she would take her in. Mr. Courser's leniency wasn't rewarded with any change in behaviour from Catebread. On the 27th of May, she was back at North London, but Mr. Bross was in the chair to oversee her 346th court case. PC 489J described how he'd been called to a disturbance in a pub where she was refused service for already being too drunk. He asked her to quit, to go home, and she became very abusive. Catebread denied being drunk, but the officer insisted he'd been obliged to call for help and an ambulance. Catebread, as usual, apologised and promised reform. Mr. Bross sentenced her to a month, and as she was being led away, she was heard to mutter, "It might have been a different story if Mr. Courser had been here." Her pleas for lenient treatment clearly worked better on some magistrates than they did on others, a reminder that the exercise of discretion was part and parcel of a police magistrate's role. When Jane next came back before Mr. Cawser in late July, it was for what the papers numbered her 349th appearance, her 50th at North London. Jane came in clutching all her worldly belongings in her usual bundle and bowed to his worship. Having heard a familiar report of her drunkenness, bad language, and the necessity to carry her away on a police ambulance, the magistrate told the jailer to put her back to the cells while he decided what to do with her. Jane Catebread's story was, like Faye's, told nationwide. The Yorkshire Evening Post reported that one London police court missionary, Robert Smith, had described Catebread as a physical enigma. Morally, she has no more backbone than a jellyfish. The author of the Yorkshire Echoes quipped that this was a slur on jellyfish, since they had a stricter code of morals. Catebread had been held by many people, the article's author continued, but to no purpose. He concluded that her name was against her. Catebread is extremely susceptible to moisture and soon becomes a limp wreck, he finished. Whilst this was an attempt at witticism, it also reveals a prevalent contemporary attitude towards women like Jane Catebread. They were considered weak-willed and lacking in the moral fibre required to resist indulging their weakness for alcohol. If they got arrested for drunkenness, then they should suffer the consequences. Smith probably did not share that point of view, believing that the revolving door of imprisonment was having no effect on her. He stopped short of saying publicly that she required medical assistance, but implied this in his statement that Catebread's power to resist drink is wholly gone. Totty's promise to the Marlborough Street magistrate was also an empty one. In early June 1892, she was arrested in Oxford Street, where she was found drunk and dancing in front of two cardboard boxes. She'd drawn a crowd, and a policeman asked her to leave, but she refused, saying she was waiting for her sister to fetch her in a carriage. Totty claimed that a bystander, a gentleman, tried to intervene and speak to the inspector at the station house on her behalf. The police witness confirmed this, but added that as soon as the man had been informed of the prisoner's name, he backed off, refusing to leave his. The Good Samaritan presumably thought the police were harassing an innocent, if mentally unstable woman. Once he was apprised of Totty's reputation, he withdrew his gallant support. Once again, her notoriety preceded her. She was remanded for a week. When she was brought up again, she had a solicitor appointed to represent her. This was unusual for Totty. The brief, a Mr. Arthur Newton, had been instructed by a gentleman. Was this the same person that attempted to help when she was arrested? Maybe it was. Newton pleaded for leniency. Since she'd already served a week in custody, would the magistrate leave it at that? Mr. Hannay recognised it as a melancholy case, and at one that made him despair. He said, "You see, if she is sent to prison, she is here almost directly after she is released. Fortunately, in London, there are very few of such cases. In mercy to the woman, I must send her to jail for a month." Totty didn't seem to mind much. It was a roof over her head and some basic food. "God bless you, sir," she said as she was taken down. In August 1892, she was charged at Marlborough Street for another episode of drunken disorderly behaviour in Great Western Road. Her resort to abominable language earned her a night in the cells. She gave her by now almost required performance in court and was sent to prison for another 4 weeks. This arrest had prompted a change in heart from the writer of Yorkshire Echoes. He suggested that Faye and Catebread might be better served by an initiative proposed in Germany, enforced restraint under proper medical care. Totty Faye was, like Jane or Annie Catebread, past reclamation. Yet, if ever there was a case of utter irresponsibility of the individual, this is one, he wrote, and continued, "She cannot be kept in ordinary refuges. She is beyond moral restraint. She is a disease." Whilst hardly a sympathetic view of the problems afflicting Totty Faye or Jane Catebread, it did at least signal that an alternative viewpoint was in circulation. The simple locking up of inebriates in prison was ineffectual and increasingly seen as inappropriate. The continued and widespread reportage of these women's desperate lives had crossed a line in 1892. Now they were not merely being seen as objects of fun or examples of the moral degradation of their class of womanhood. They were beginning to emerge as a problem that needed a new solution. It may also be the case that Totty herself had reached a critical point in her life. In September, she may well have attempted to take her own life. She was certainly charged as such, suicide still being an offence in law in 1892. She was brought up at Marylebone Police Court on the 17th of September, a Saturday, where she gave her name as Lillian Vivian, 37 years of age. She said she was a governess residing at Kentish Town Road. Whilst dressed as she normally did in her own eccentric style, a plain, waterproof, and wore a large white straw hat looped at the sides and trimmed with dirty white lace and a few faded flowers, she presented with less of her usual bravado. PC Gattrell reported that he'd seen her by Gloucester Gate Bridge at Camden Town at 2 a.m, staring into the water. As she threw away her possessions and looked about to leap into the canal, the policeman ran and caught hold of her. "Oh, do let me alone," she cried. "I'm in low spirits." She denied the charge in court and said she was only stooping to tie her bootlaces. She also denied being drunk. The jailer there confirmed that Totty had only just come out of prison after serving a month, and the magistrate discharged her, either because he had some sympathy for her or because there was insufficient evidence to support a charge of attempted suicide. "God bless you," she told him. "You're a gentleman." A few days later, Totty was up before a magistrate again, as Mabel arraigned, and she'd reverted to her previous and familiar incarnation. Arrested for drunken disorderly behaviour in Paddington, after she had again had an argument with a cabbie, she got a warning and 3 days inside. As we know already, Totty had a long string of previous convictions for drunken disorderly behaviour, and a couple of more serious ones for fraud or theft. In October 1892, it was fraud and theft that once again landed her in jail. When a commercial traveller named Mr. Hetherington answered his door at the Temperance Hotel on Queen Square, he was met by a woman wearing a shawl over her head. "I beg your pardon," she said. "I thought this was the waitress's room." She complained of being ill and asked him to fetch some brandy. As he went off to do so, she entered his room and stole £3 of his money. She was charged at Clerkenwell Police Court, where Hetherington explained that Totty had first threatened him with 5 years if he proceeded with a charge against her, and then promised to repay the money if he dropped them. In custody at Hunter Street Police Station, Totty vehemently denied taking the man's money. "I would not be so mean as to do a thing like that. If I wanted to thieve, I should steal diamonds," she said. The magistrate committed her to face a jury trial at the next sessions. When it came to the court, the jury convicted her. Once again, she claimed she was an orphan young lady and blamed all her misfortunes on drink. She begged not to be incarcerated, saying she would lose her reason if placed in solitude again. Given her recent alleged suicide attempt by the canal at Camden, there was good reason to think that Totty was genuinely concerned about being sent to prison for a long stretch. Not that this cut much ice with the judge, who sentenced her to 3 years penal servitude. In November, the press carried reports that a Mr. J.C. Phillips of Holloway had written to the Home Secretary requesting him to reconsider the sentence of 3 years penal servitude passed on Totty Fay. The Home Secretary, Herbert Henry Asquith, the Liberal MP and future Prime Minister, wrote back declining his request. Fay's fears of being driven insane by the confines of prison were realised in December that year. Under the headline, "The Last of Totty Fay," the papers carried variations of the following story. The unfortunate woman, who is known as Totty Fay, has, the London correspondent of the Yorkshire Herald reported, after a careful examination, been declared a lunatic. This means she will be removed from the prison at Wormwood Scrubs to a lunatic asylum. It also means that, though she will henceforth be treated with much consideration, she is not likely to make her appearance again in London. Exactly where that asylum was isn't clear, at least not until late 1892. However, when 2 journalists from the Sun newspaper visited Broadmoor in February 1894, for the purposes of visiting the criminal lunatic supposed to be Jack the Ripper, they reported that Totty Fay was an inmate there. She was, the report explained, stated to be very violent. Maniacal was the word they used in the official document, and had to be removed from her room to a cell where there was no furniture to break or glass to smash. Throughout her police court career, Totty Fay had often declared that she had left her luggage at one of London's railway stations. In June 1896, her possessions were said to be still at the booking office of the Great Western Railway. Lloyd's newspaper reported that some 3 years ago she deposited a basket of clothes, a parcel wrapped in newspaper, and 6 pots of flowers. She left instructions for the flowers to be watered and promised to return in a few days. On that occasion, she left the police station. She left the railway station under arrest after causing a scene, and this report noted that no application had been made by the St Giles Board of Guardians of the Poor to collect her possessions. And this, it would seem, is the last time Totty Fay troubled the newspapers in person, so to speak. The other occasions when her name was used was either in connection with debates on habitual drunkenness, like the reference to the Dean of Hereford above, or when some occupant of the police court dock resembled her or her transgressions in some way. So, for example, in January 1893, Mary Byers, a woman who was known to the police as Poll, was charged with being drunk and disorderly in Coleshill Street in Birmingham. On Wednesday night, she was locked up by the constable for being drunk. The report in the Daily Post continued when she said she was Totty Fay. The woman was fined, and the paper noted it was the second time within 2 days that a woman has professed to rejoice in the name of Totty Fay. As for the real Totty Fay or Amy Anderson, I think it's likely that she perished inside Broadmoor. I can't check this at the moment, but once lockdown restrictions are fully open, I'll be able to consult the hospital's records. But years of alcohol abuse and almost constant periods of incarceration in Millbank or the Scrubs would have taken a severe toll on her health. In 1895, she would have been just 30, but might have looked closer to 40 or 50. In the 1870s, a long campaign led by 2 prominent doctors, one an MP, led Parliament to pass legislation aimed at treating those suffering from the affliction of drunkenness. The 1879 Habitual Drunkards Act was watered down as it passed through both houses and ended up as an entirely voluntary and therefore largely ineffectual tool to deal with a widespread social problem. Donald Dalrymple, as a Member of Parliament for the Liberals, had introduced his bill in 1870, and it secured the support of the BMA, the British Medical Association. The BMA took a leading role in arguing that drunkenness was not simply a moral failing, but a treatable medical condition. Dr. Kerr, his colleague, insisted that if medical treatment were allowed to replace imprisonment, it offered a real possibility of cure. Dalrymple ran the Higham Lunatic Asylum in Norwich, and so had first-hand experience of working with mental illness. He recognised the system failed those suffering from alcoholism. Anyone deemed insane by reason of drink could be sent to a lunatic asylum, but could not be held long enough to be permanently cured. Once they dried out, they had to be allowed to leave, or the asylums could face charges of false imprisonment. This hamstrung the efforts of magistrates and police courts to deal with the problem of habitual drunkards, and because without alternative sanctions, all they could do was impose sureties and enforce repeated and futile periods of imprisonment. Dalrymple's 1870 bill drew fire from those who continued to see drunkenness amongst the working classes differently, as something best punished by imprisonment and not by care in a more comfortable reformatory. As a result, it was amended to exclude all those charged with criminal offences. The 1879 Act allowed individuals to be admitted to an inebriate reformatory rather than a lunatic asylum, as had previously been the case, so long as they consented both to surrender their liberty on arrival and pay for their keep and treatment. So if a person agreed to enter a reformatory, he couldn't leave until he reached the end of his period of care. If he absconded, staff could forcibly bring him back. Understandably, then, critics complained that the legislation only helped those wealthy and reasonable enough to agree to be committed to an asylum, not women like Fay or Cakebread. The Act was a fudged and ineffectual piece of legislation, but it had defined what a habitual drunkard was, a person who, by means of habitual intemperate drinking of intoxicating liquor, is dangerous to himself or herself or to others, or incapable of managing himself or herself and his or her affairs. Dalrymple died in 1873 without seeing his legislation pass through Parliament, but thereafter the medical profession was set on a course of gaining state recognition and thereafter state action of the need to treat alcoholism as a mental health and social issue and not as a criminal one. In the years following the implementation of the 1879 Act, campaigners continued to press for further legislation to deal with the problem of alcoholism in society. The press fueled the debate by carrying regular reports of offenders like Cakebread and Fay appearing before magistrates who could do nothing but imprison them in regular jails with little hope or expectation of reform. The modern concept of the revolving door of recidivism seems entirely applicable to late Victorian criminal drunkenness. Moreover, for the Victorians, drunkenness was increasingly associated with degeneracy, and this contributed to concerns about the state of the working class, particularly the existence of an underclass, the so-called residuum. Within this, women were deemed especially at risk, as they might pass the taint on and or damage their children, the future of population, if they continued to drink during pregnancy. In addition, drunkenness in married women was seen to be a causal or contributory factor in alcoholism amongst men. This was also linked, Lucy Zedner argues, to women invading the public male sphere by drinking in pubs. Drink was clearly then a gendered social issue, made much more obvious by the focus of attention on the likes of Totty Fay and Jane Catebread. Following a government inquiry, the Departmental Committee on the Treatment of Inebriates in 1893-4 concluded that the only way forward was in compulsory long-term confinement of persistent offenders in reformatories. The resulting bill was again diluted by amendments in the laws, but reached a statute in 1898 as the Inebriates Act. The Act amended the 79 Habitual Drunkards Act and extended its reach to include those who deemed to be criminal habitual drunkards. Perhaps most significantly, it adopted inebriates rather than drunkards, reflecting the medical profession's approach, and in particular, that of the Society for the Study and Care of Inebriacy. So long as the court was convinced that any indictable offence the accused was charged with was committed under the influence of drink, or that drunkenness was a contributing cause of the offence, it could, in addition to any normal penalties, order the person to be confined in a reformatory for up to 3 years. The accused also had to admit they were a habitual drunkard, and the court had to have been informed of this before she came before a jury. Moreover, if someone was convicted 4 times of an offence relating to drunkenness, this act now gave magistrates the power to send them to an inebriate reformatory for up to 3 years. So both those who committed serious criminal offences while drunk and those habitual drunks who clogged up the police courts could be detained for up to 3 years in order to keep them away from drink long enough to fortify their will to abstain. However, as one informed observer, a London magistrate writing in 1897 noted, "How can you cure a drunkard by sending them to a common prison with hard labour for a month? The thing is impossible absurd." The 1888 Act addressed this failing in part, but it didn't offer a panacea for alcoholism. I think it's worth reflecting on what we can sensibly say about Totty Fay, or more appropriately, Amy Anderson, once we remove the hyperbole surrounding her court appearances. She grew up in Seven Dials, an area of central London notorious for both its poverty and criminality, by creating the character of Totty or Mabel Carlton, Lily St. Leon, Dolly LeBlanc, Lily St. Herbert, Violet St. John, May Lily, Maud Rothschild, Amy Violet, Florence Lorande, Lily St. Clair, and Mabel Gray. Anderson, adopting the persona of a lady, one that had travelled abroad and occasionally affected a French accent, she was distancing herself from her humble origins. Her MMO was set up quite early on and seems to have changed little. Anderson was caught up in the cycle of poverty, prostituting herself from at least her mid to late teens, possibly being forced into it as many girls and young women were. She dressed flamboyantly. She wore plenty of cheap and showy jewellery, bling to use a modern term. She drank, whether as part of the ritual of attracting men as customers at first, and then as a form of numbing anaesthetic to allow her to cope with the awful set of cards life had dealt her. Thereafter, she went on to become alcohol dependent. This probably undermined her ability to work as a prostitute as well, or at least her ability to command a better sort of client. She would visit hotels to find clients, or pick them up in the West End theatres and drinking venues and took them to hotels. So she would probably have been well known to the porters, probably having to bribe them from time to time. Her comment that the porter at Fisher's would have known the sort of woman she was when she let her in is suggestive of a practice that, while being nominally illegal, was prevalent and hard to police. By the 1890s, Totty, reduced to alcoholism and in a cycle of imprisonment that she seemed unable to break, would have nowhere to live and very little means of support. It's highly unlikely she had much in the way of savings, so with no money for food or lodging, and perhaps crucially none for drink, once out of prison, she headed back to her old haunts and attempted to bluff her way in and live for free. In some cases, she may have been successful on the simple basis that those she encountered were either fooled by her or didn't want the attention of a court hearing. But perhaps increasingly this became difficult, and with a string of convictions behind her, she inevitably started to collect more prolonged terms of imprisonment. Given the nature of the Victorian prison system, which did its utmost to break the spirit of its victims, the cycle of incarceration would have had a severely detrimental effect on Anderson's health, physicality, and mentality. Health physically and mentally. For Jane Cakebread, the pattern of recidivism was similar but less destructive because she served shorter sentences as a result of not compounding her alcoholism with other crimes. She was still a desperate person and lived a desperate existence, and it's a reminder, should we need one, that the lives of working class women, particularly single women, were extremely hard. Choices were limited, opportunities to fall foul of the law were ever present, and the chances of getting back on the straight and narrow severely hampered by the constant surveillance of the police. The Inebriants Act was not much better than the legislation it replaced, but it was an important recognition of alcoholism as a mental illness and not simply a sign of character weakness. The lives of Totty Fay and Jane Cakebread would be unknown to us, of course, just as the lives of the women murdered by the Ripper would be hidden from history, were it not for the impact they had on popular culture, the court system, and perhaps ultimately the pressure to do something about alcoholism among London's poorest. So, thank you for listening, and let's raise a glass of something to Totty Fay, a woman of some substance who's left her own distinctive mark on history.